Hello, Descartes. It looks like Descartes, but both of the S's are silent, and it's just Descartes because French, I guess. We're jumping ahead about 1600 so years from Aristotle, and there are a couple chapters in your book about some things that were happening in that time period. And I mentioned in the Aristotle video a little bit more about what took place during this period, but I do encourage you to read those if you are interested, and I can certainly recommend other things. But the Roman Empire was a big fan of Aristotle, and not a whole lot happened that was contrary to his philosophical viewpoints during this time period. But Descartes belonged to a totally different sort of world. You lost the central authority of the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Empire in general, and the world was essentially blown wide open as far as intellectual discovery was concerned. People no longer had as big of a fear of talking about things that ran contrary to Catholicism or Aristotle. So you had a lot of things happening in science, you had a lot of things happening in mathematics, you had a lot of things happening in philosophy, and Descartes was active in all of these areas. And if you ever remember anything from math, it was noted as Cartesian, especially in geometry. That's the same guy who was equally influential on mathematics as he was on philosophy. Now, from my own totally non legit survey, I would say that probably 60 at least, maybe even I'd go as high to say 65% of people who are philosophers, either by trade or by hobby, got into philosophy because of Descartes. And I think part of this is because Descartes is taught in pretty much every intro to philosophy class on the planet. You because of that, you can get most of his works at any used bookstore and for literally like a penny on Amazon. And I think that the Meditations on First Philosophy in particular is worth a buy and a read. It's a very small book that's pretty easy to get through. Descartes was sort of a hermit, and he was very weak physically. He was sick a lot and sort of frail, but his intellectual strength and prowess more than made up for it, and his schools even would make accommodations for him to be able to sleep later in the day and to not have to do as many strenuous physical activities as some of the other students. And he lived alone. He didn't get married or have a bunch of children or anything like that. He was very much a hermit. He did have some servants and got one of them pregnant, but the child didn't survive very long, and he didn't view that as the start of any sort of family unit by any means. So that's not super uncommon for, I think, any branch of intellectualism, for people to tend to be less than social creatures. Descartes is certainly not the last person that we will see with those sorts of tendencies. But he did a lot of different things in his life. He was French, and he actually wrote his works in French. Most scholars of the time were writing in Latin, which essentially only other scholars were able to read. So they were writing for one another, which is a very, to this day, common practice in lots of scholarly fields, including philosophy, is that they tend to write for themselves and for each other, not for the masses outside of the discipline. But Descartes purposely published and wrote his books in French so that the average French citizen could have access to them and could read them, which was uncommon, but no doubt much appreciated. He caught the interest of Queen Christina from Sweden, which is a particularly interesting historical figure to read about. And she invited intellectuals from all over the world, Europe in particular, to come and to give talks and have dinners and to teach her things. And she invited Descartes to come and teach her philosophy. And reluctantly, he did. And she wanted him to start teaching her philosophy at, by some accounts, 4 a.m., by other accounts, 5 a.m. Either way, way too early for me to ever want to talk about philosophy. I taught an 8 a.m. philosophy class once. It was philosophy of death and dying, and never again. Nobody wants to talk about death or philosophy at 8 a.m., myself included. So he ended up getting very ill. It was very cold in Sweden. He wasn't used to the winters, and he actually died as a result. And the story of what happened to his remains, his skeleton, after his death is almost as fascinating as what he did with his life when he was alive. Russell Shorto has a book about it called Descartes' Bones, and it's fascinating. And it actually, he writes a lot about his philosophical viewpoints and intellectual achievements in the book as well. But it's very accessible, and I highly recommend it if you do find this intriguing. So, enough about that. So, let's talk about what Descartes actually was talking about. So, you had the sort of world blown open intellectually as far as different possibilities and belief systems, and you no longer had to sort of follow the knowledge that was pre-approved and spread by the Roman Empire, which meant that people were able to come out publicly without fear and to say a lot of these beliefs are false. A lot of them we have no idea if they're true, and maybe some of them are actually true and worth holding on to. But a lot of work was to be done to sort of figure out what should we continue to hold as true, what should we question and investigate, and what should we just reject and replace. And this is a project that no one person could take on, and obviously knowledge is consistently even still changing now as a result of this whole movement. But Descartes' strategy is going to be an interesting one. What he wanted to know is what's left. If we want to say that we have knowledge, what does that mean? Now, you may remember that Plato and Aristotle were very concerned about knowledge and how to get it. And Plato said knowledge is gained by contemplating the forms. Aristotle said that it was by asking certain questions, determining the causes of physical objects, and that it was a physical explanation. We've heard a lot of people talking about knowledge, but Descartes was the first person that really wanted to question the study and the ability to have knowledge at all. So, can we really know anything for sure? And if so, how do we know it? And how do we know that we know it? The branch of philosophy that deals with questions like this about knowledge and truth and how we get either of those things is known as epistemology. And it's essentially the study of thinking. And Descartes was the big person that brought this to the forefront of philosophical thought. And that was to say, okay, what's left? What do we actually know for sure? Now that we can actually investigate and figure this out, where do we start? What do we know for sure? Well, it would be absolutely impossible for Descartes to look at every single possible belief that anybody held at the time and to individually say yes or no, true or false for everything. There's just not enough time. Even if you have zero social life or any other commitments, it's still an impossible task to be able to do that single-handedly. So instead of doing that, Descartes is going to approach this from a much broader perspective. And what he's going to do is he's going to essentially question all of it at once. And his method is known as methodic doubt. The conclusion that he reaches is essentially rationalism. And this sort of rabbit hole trail is going to end in the most famous quote in the history of philosophy. So here's this sort of process and where it leads. So instead of questioning each thing individually, Descartes wants to ask, what can we doubt? Because if I can doubt something, then that means I don't know it with absolute certainty. So I think that right now my best friend is at work because my best friend works in the evenings. It is now evening. I'm just guessing that's where my best friend is. But I don't know that for sure with a capital K because I can doubt whether or not my best friend is at work. They could have had the day off. They could have left early for some sort of emergency. They could have gone out to lunch. There could have been all sorts of other possibilities. So I can doubt whether or not my best friend is at work. If I can doubt it, then I don't know it for certain. Because if I know something for certain, that means there's no possible way that I could be wrong. So it's worth repeating here that when philosophers say things like knowledge and truth and certainty, they mean something a lot more fierce than when we say things like, I know that this team is going to win the Super Bowl this year, or I'm certain that that person's going to be at the party, or whenever we throw these terms around when we're not really certain and we don't really know it for sure to the level that Descartes wants to make sure we know it. So this is a very fierce, like, there's no possible way I can be wrong. So think about this. If Descartes can find something that I can't even doubt whether or not it's true, then that's a pretty solid foundation. Like, if I can't even doubt it with any sort of insane scenario, then that seems pretty certain. So what he's going to do is not just start doubting things, because that would be highly disorganized. And if you try to do it in an organized manner, there's just too much to do individually or even by category. So instead, Descartes is going to say, okay, what is the basis for almost all of our knowledge about the world? It's our sensory perceptions, right? And by senses, we mean your sight and your hearing and your taste and your sense of smell and your sense of touch. Those are typically thought of as our senses. Heads up, we have a lot more than that. You have a sense of locomotion. You have a sense of hunger, right? We have all sorts of other senses. The reason why we tend to have a narrow list is because that was Aristotle's list of senses. And that's still the prevalent one that we even think of now. But we use our senses to have knowledge about the world. The reason why I know that the sky is blue is because I can see it through my window and it's blue. I know that there is coffee in my cup because I can look at it and it looks like coffee. I can smell it and it smells like coffee. And I can taste it and it tastes like coffee. So, whether it's a big piece of knowledge, whether it's a small piece of knowledge, most of our knowledge comes from our sensory perception, the way things look. By far the most popular sensory perception for knowledge, but the way they smell, the way they taste, what we hear, what we touch, all of these things are the base for the overwhelming majority amount of information that we derive from our world and ourselves and our surroundings and other people. How do we know the mood that other people are in? Because of the way their facial expressions look, because of the way their tone of their voice sounds, right? All of these sorts of things. These are all sensory perceptions. So, most of the things that people had said that they knew for certain was based on their sensory perceptions. So what Descartes' going to do is he's just going to doubt our senses. Now, everybody has had an experience where they realize that their senses have deceived them. You think you feel your phone vibrating in your pocket, or you think you hear whatever your text alert sound is, but you look at your phone and there's nothing. It's a phantom vibration. You think you see your friend and you go to say what's up and you realize that's not them, and then you feel like an idiot and you're going to try to play it off or whatever you want to do. We've all been mistaken. You've all taken a drink of something and you thought that it was something other than it was. So you think it's water, but it's actually Sprite or whatever, right? And it doesn't really matter what you expect or what it is. It's like a horrible experience, right? For some reason, even if you don't mind what it is that you're actually ingesting. So we've all had situations in which our senses deceived us, in which we were mistaken in what we thought we saw or heard or felt or whatever. So Descartes' question is, how big could those mistakes go? How big could that deception be? How wrong could our senses actually turn out? What if it's not just certain isolated incidences, but what if it's the whole thing that is flawed and deceptive? And how would we know if it was? So here is the way that Descartes described this way of doubting our senses. How do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? Now you're talking about Descartes in 1605, 1610, sitting here in on a desk with a candle because there's no electricity yet, and that would be horrible. Writing with a quill, right, in a jar of ink because there wasn't even a pen, right, and a proper notebook of paper. He's writing and he's saying, how do I know that I'm not dreaming right now? Well, it feels like I'm awake. I feel like I can interact with physical objects in the way that I interact with them when I'm awake. Well, I mean, when you're in your dream, it feels real, right? You have objects in your dream that you can interact with, and they feel real while you're asleep. Well, I remember waking up today. Right? It doesn't seem like I'm dreaming right now. I feel like I remember waking up in my bed. Okay, well, have you ever had a dream where you woke up in the dream, but it was still just another dream? Maybe that's what's happening. Well, in my dreams, I can do things that I can't do when I'm awake. Like in my dreams, I can fly, or I'm like a total badass in a fight, and there's monsters and other things that don't exist in the real world, right? It's different. Okay, well, but sometimes dreams seem totally normal. Have you ever had a dream where you felt like you were at work and it was just a normal day at work, and then you wake up and you have to go to work, and you're like, I just put in like an 8-hour shift overnight? And I gotta actually go. So couldn't it just be that some dreams are normal and they seem real, and some dreams are sort of fantastical and filled with all sorts of bizarre things that don't seem quite as normal compared to the mundane? Supposedly there's things that you're not supposed to be able to do in dreams, like to adjust lighting or to read words or numbers. But I don't think that's true. I actually tend to read in my dreams quite a bit. And I'm always so impressed with whatever I'm reading because I'm aware that my brain made it up. And it's not something that my brain could make up if I was consciously trying to write something. And couldn't you just say that sometimes in your dreams you can do those things and sometimes you can't? So here's the thing. Descartes' not trying to convince you that you are dreaming. He's trying to convince you that you can't prove that you're not. So maybe right now you're dreaming. You think that you're sitting wherever you are on whatever computer or sort of device you have watching this video, and you think that I'm a real person and your computer screen is a real object and that whatever is surrounding you in the room is real, but it's not. It's all just a dream. None of it actually exists. It's all in your mind. And you're just dreaming the whole world and everybody else in it. Now, again, Descartes' not saying that there's a whole lot of evidence for that, but what he's saying is if we want to know what I can know for certain, well, I can doubt that I have a cup of coffee in my hand, because if I'm dreaming, there's no actual cup of coffee. Now, it certainly feels real. It smells real. It tastes real. I feel the weight of the cup. If I break it, right, it'll get water everywhere. I might cut myself. All those things will feel incredibly real. But they would feel real if I was dreaming as well. There's a reason why people wake up out of breath and totally stressed out from a nightmare. It's because it feels real. It's only after the fact, when you look back and find out that our language is completely inadequate to describe dream experiences, that it seems weird. Right? You try to explain your dream. It was your house, but it wasn't your house, and you were there, but it wasn't you, but I knew it was you. Right? I mean, it seems weird in retrospect, but at the time, all of that felt totally normal while it was happening. So it could just be that some of our dreams seem odd, some seem normal. But while it's happening, it all seems equally real. And a big part of that is because your brain can't tell the difference. What happens to your brain when you are being chased in your dream is what your brain does when you're being chased in real life. Your brain doesn't realize that it's asleep. Which seems like a major design flaw, just by the way, that your brain can't tell reality from fantasy. That seems like that would be a useful thing that wouldn't be that complicated in such a complex system as the brain. But anyways, I'm not a neurologist or a neuroscientist by any means. So Descartes' going to just question all of our sensory perceptions in one big swoop. And if you're probably thinking Inception right now, if you've seen that movie, that's a great adaptation of exactly what Descartes was talking about back in 1650 was when he died. He was talking about it before then, but a long time ago. So the next thing that he's going to suggest is maybe it's all a big deception. Maybe we're all being fooled. And he calls it the evil genius, sometimes also called the evil demon, that might deceive us. And basically what Descartes was thinking is, maybe it's not my own mind playing tricks on me in a dream state. Maybe somebody outside of me is causing me to have these experiences that seem really real, but they're not. Now, if we were going to talk about something like that happening now, we would probably say it was like The Matrix, which is another adaptation of what Descartes is talking about here. Or we might say that you're a brain in a jar, right? If we learn enough about the brain to be able to, with pinpoint accuracy, determine what neurons are responsible for what sorts of mental events and experiences, and we're a very long way away from being able to do this, by the way. But eventually, there's no reason to think that it's not possible to figure out how to do that. We're learning more about how to map the brain. We're learning about what parts of the brain control what sorts of experiences and what sorts of mental processes. Now, within each little patch, there's like a billion possible neurons that could be responsible, but presumably in the future, somebody would be able to plug you in and stimulate the right places to give you false experiences that you're not actually having. They could give you the experience of having, I don't know, a sailboat out in the middle of the ocean and a beautiful picnic lunch with your whole family. But it could end up being that none of those people exist, that the ocean isn't even a real thing, that boats aren't actual objects, and that your physical body isn't even real. You're just a wrinkled gray brain in a jar being poked around. We know enough about the brain to know that if you have somebody with their brain exposed when you're doing some sort of open brain surgery, either to remove a tumor or to wrap a coil around an aneurysm so it doesn't burst, that the person can be totally conscious and awake for these sorts of surgeries under certain cases, and your actual brain doesn't have any nerve endings, so you can't feel it if people are poking around in there, which sounds sort of squeamish. But certain times in certain situations, certain people are totally awake for the experience, and neuroscientists can poke around a little bit and ask questions. They can literally stimulate this part of the brain and say, okay, what are you experiencing? And the person can say, I smell burnt toast. Okay, how about this? I see the color green. Right? What about this? I hear my mom whistling this lullaby she sang me as a kid. Right? And it seems like that experience is really happening, but it's not. It's just being falsely stimulated. But again, your brain thinks it's real. So Descartes' going to say maybe we're all being deceived by an evil genius who somehow, he wouldn't have known that the brain needed to be manipulated in that sort of a way, but he did know that there was some alternate scenario where somebody outside of you could be creating this false reality and that we wouldn't know it. And that everything that we try to say to prove that that's not what's happening is consistent with that actually happening. So it feels like my physical body is real. Okay, well, it would if I was stimulating the right neuron that said physical arm feels like this. Right? It certainly seems like there's a lot of other real people in the world, including yourself, who have their own identities and their own mental thoughts and their own free will and all these other things. But maybe not. Maybe everybody else in the whole world is fake except for you. It's a lot of pressure, I guess, if that's true. But Descartes' going to say you can't prove with certainty that that's not true. We can doubt that the world is as it appears to be. So that means that we don't know anything for certain that relies on our sensory perceptions. So that takes out pretty much almost all knowledge that we could ever have. Because almost everything, if you think back far enough, is based on sensory perceptions. Even if you try to say, well, I base knowledge on facts and statistics, well, those facts and statistics were derived through an observable experiment with somebody's sensory perceptions of what was happening. So if we can doubt our senses, and that's the basis for knowledge, then what do we have left? Well, this ends in, as I mentioned, the most famous quote in the history of philosophy, cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am. No doubt you've probably heard this before. Maybe you didn't understand what it meant. Here's what Descartes meant by it. So he's doubting all of these things. He doubts his desk and his pen and his candle because he might be dreaming. He doubts his physical body because he could be a brain in a jar. He doubts the existence of everything around him, what we call the external world, which is everything outside of yourself. He doubts all that because he could be deceived by an evil genius, or he could be dreaming, or we could all be characters in somebody else's dream. Maybe we're all just part of God's dream or something. So he can doubt all of that. So here's the thought process. Okay, I'm doubting. And I can't doubt that I'm doubting, because that's still just doubting. So if I doubt that there's doubting going on, then that's still just more doubt, so there's still doubt happening. And I can't doubt that, because that's still doubt. So I know that doubt is happening, and doubting is a thought process. So I know that there's thinking going on, and I can't doubt that there's thought, because that itself is more thought. And if I'm aware of the thinking and the thoughts and the doubt, and I seem to be in control of the thought and the doubt, then that thinking must be mine somehow, because I'm aware of it. And I feel like I can control the thought process. So I can't doubt that there's thinking happening, and I can't really doubt that I'm attached to it, because it takes me to doubt myself, and that doesn't work, because that's still me doubting. So I can't doubt that there's thinking going on and that it's a part of me. So I think, therefore I am. Meaning, because I'm thinking and I can't doubt that I'm thinking, then that means there is something that is me that has to exist. Now, this doesn't mean that I exist in the way that I perceive myself. I might not have a physical body. If I do, I might not look like this. I might not be the age or the gender or the type of personality that I think that I am, but there's something that's me. Even if I am just a brain in a jar, that's still me somehow. So there's something that is me that is thinking and doubting, and I can't doubt that, and I know that I exist. But this only ever works for the person that's doing it. So I can't say, you're thinking, you exist, because you might be a character in my dream. Or you might be a fake neural impulse that I've been given. Right? You might not exist at all. So, to me at least. So this can only be said for the person who's doing the thinking. So this really doesn't leave us with a whole lot to work with, obviously. So at the end of this rabbit hole, we're not really left with a whole lot in the knowledge department. But Descartes' not going to just abandon ship and say, all right, well, there you go, that's what you have. Because he wants to build our knowledge back up. And his method for doing this is bizarre, and there's two reasons for this. The first is because Descartes was Catholic, even though the Roman Catholic Church no longer was the central authority. Most people in Europe were still Catholic, including Descartes. And the second reason he's going to go bizarre is because he doesn't have a whole lot of other options, because he can't rely on anything that relies on his senses, because he's already said that none of that is reliable with any amount of certainty. So he's got to build our knowledge back up using only rationality. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that we know for sure. Thought. So, not an easy thing to try to prove all knowledge just by thinking about it without relying on anything in the world around you. So here was Descartes' bizarre strategy. He's going to try to prove that God exists. And he thinks that that's going to solve pretty much everything. Because if he can prove that God exists, then he says God wouldn't allow us to be deceived. So if I can prove that God exists, and I can prove that God wouldn't let me be that deceived or mistaken about my circumstances, then I can be confident that the world actually is as it appears to be, and that my senses are not deceiving me. Now, I think that this is a really, really interesting strategy because he doesn't question God's existence. He questions his own existence. He questions the existence of literally everyone and everything on the planet and in the universe and in the sky, but he doesn't question God's existence, which seems bizarre to stop the doubt there, but also shows you how hardcore that belief still was, despite having the freedom to think difficult or differently than what the Roman Catholic Church was saying. Also interesting is that Descartes sets it upon himself to prove God's existence, not to question it, not to try to disprove it, just to prove it. He already thought it was true, but he wanted to prove it using his rationality. And a lot of people at the time were very mad that Descartes chose to do this. How dare you even think it needs to be proved? That in itself was almost considered blasphemous. And his book had a lot of controversy surrounding it because he tried to prove God's existence, and that was something that just didn't need to be proved. So that's interesting. So he's going to try to prove God's existence, but it's going to be really, really weird the way that he does it, because he can't rely on the world. He can't rely on his senses. Most arguments for God's existence, there was a bunch from St. Thomas Aquinas in here, and pretty much all of his, as well as the most popular ones to this date, and a lot of them are Aquinas's, rely on the world, right? They look at the complexity in the world and they say it must be intelligently designed. Descartes can't rely on anything in the world because he said that our senses of it might be mistaken and the world could be totally different or even not exist. He can't do that. People talk about cause and effect. There had to be a first cause to get the whole thing going. Well, Descartes can't rely on that because that relies on observing cause and effect in physical objects in a physical world with our senses. Descartes tells us that's not reliable. He can't rely on that either. He can't rely on people's personal experiences. He can't rely on the Bible. He can't rely on miracles. He can't rely on a feeling of religious euphoria or spiritualism. He can't rely on any of these sorts of things that people usually use to justify God's existence, because they all rely on our senses, which he's already told us we don't know for certain. So he's got to prove God just by using his brain and rationality. And this is way harder to do than you think it is. So we get two arguments for God's existence here, and he had a lot more that are in the Meditations on First Philosophy, which is the same place where he talks about the mind-body stuff, which is here in your book, and the I think therefore I am stuff. It's all in one nice little volume. So here are the arguments for God's existence. The first one, and these are both hard to understand, so stick with me. The first one deals with the idea of perfection. So the idea is that God is perfect. However, I am imperfect, and everything around me is imperfect, and everything that I have ever seen or heard about or learned about has been imperfect. So the question is, how could I have an idea of perfection if it doesn't exist? Because an imperfect mind could not come up with the idea of perfection. So something that is perfect must exist for me to even have knowledge of perfection. Because there's no way that the idea of perfection could come from something imperfect. It can only come from something which is perfect. Now, again, this is sort of like a weird way to do it, but again, it all has to be just by thinking about it. So, this is a really interesting way to do this, but I think that there are several problems with it, which were brought to Descartes' attention even while he was still alive. So, here's one possible criticism. First of all, I don't think that we really can have a concept of perfection. Not really. We can say perfect, but I don't think that we can actually imagine perfection. We could just imagine something that's like way, way better than what we've seen. So, typically the adjectives used to describe God are all knowing, all loving, and all powerful. Now, I can imagine the most knowledgeable person, the most intelligent person I've ever met, and then just imagine somebody that knew like way more than they did. And I can imagine the most powerful, strong, capable person I've ever met, and then imagine somebody that's like just way more powerful and capable than they are. Same thing with loving. I can think of the most loving person I know and imagine somebody even way more loving than them all the time. I can amplify what I've seen, but I don't think that I can accurately conceptualize something that is 100% powerful, 100% knowledgeable, and 100% loving in every situation all the time in a perfect way. I don't think we're really capable of understanding exactly what that would be like. So I don't think we can even have a real conception of perfection. I think that we can just imagine a way better version of the things that we already acknowledge and appreciate. Of course, the problem with that is that it takes our sensory perceptions to acknowledge those qualities and to notice those qualities and to imagine those being improved upon. We have to have some basis for those. But I also think that not only can we now really have a concept of perfection, but everybody's concept is different. I mean, we don't even all agree on what a perfect pizza would be, let alone a perfect being, a perfect entity. Some people think a perfect God is one that is very full of wrath and jealousy and violence and vengeance, like the Old Testament God or the Jewish God, who teaches people lessons and smites people when they sin and is very fire and brimstone. A lot of people, that's the perfect God. Other people, their perfect God is much more loving and full of mercy and grace and forgiveness, like the New Testament God and the God that Jesus was telling people about. For a lot of people, that's the perfect God. Well, I mean, those are two very different conceptions of God, and then there's a lot of people that think that, you know, the perfect God is a mixture of these two things. But, I mean, even if we have a concept of perfection, that seems to be a personal conception of perfection, not a universal one. So if you're going to say that the idea of perfection can only come from something perfect, well, if we all have very different ideas of perfect, then does that mean that all of those perfections exist independently of us? That seems to be mistaken. So the second argument that he's going to give is, your book calls the ontological argument, and there's a lot of different versions of the ontological argument, which is why I'm not a huge fan of referring to it as that. Because, like, if you Google ontological argument, you're going to see a bunch of different versions of it. But what they all have in common is that they try to prove God's existence by the definition of God. So this one is even more bizarre than the perfection one. So if we describe God as the most perfect thing that has ever existed, so it's going to start with this definition of God. God is the most perfect thing we can imagine. Now, not everybody's going to agree with that definition, but most people will. Even if they don't believe in God, they still believe that, by definition, God would have to be the most perfect thing we can imagine. And if we can imagine something more perfect, then presumably that thing would be God. That's semi-controversial, but most people aren't going to necessarily disagree with the definition. So Descartes' going to say, if we define God as the most perfect thing that we can imagine, then God must exist by definition. And here's why. He's not saying if I can imagine something perfect, then it must exist because I'm imagining it. That's a terrible argument. And I hate when people say something like, God must exist because billions of people believe in God. Like, that's a terrible argument. Billions of people believed the earth was flat. Billions of people believed in Eastern religions that don't have gods, right? Doesn't mean they're automatically true. If billions of people believe Harry Potter's true, that doesn't mean it is, right? That has no bearing on it. So that's not what he's saying. Instead, this is what he's saying. Think of pizza. Okay, I'll stick with pizza. So, my perfect pizza, and feel free to disagree with this even more than you did with my pineapple topping choice earlier. I think that the perfect pizza would be Lou Malnati's butter crust with Giordano's cheese and toppings and stuff, and sort of the layering of it, and then Rosati's Chicago style sauce on the top. To me, that would be the perfect pizza. Feel free to boo and hate all you want on that. I don't really care. So that would be my idea of a perfect pizza. Now, I cannot currently get a pizza like that anywhere. And it's not like I could buy the components separately and construct it properly. That wouldn't be the same thing. So this pizza only exists as a figment of my imagination. So I have a perfect idea of pizza that's just an idea. But let's say that one of you is like this great culinary wizard and you decide to actually make that pizza and you find the exact recipe, the exact ingredients, and you're able to create this exact pizza for me. So now that pizza exists in reality and I can go eat it whenever I want. So now the question is, which one of these is better? The fake pizza that only exists in my imagination and in my dreams, or the real pizza that I can go eat whenever I want? Well, clearly, it's better if I can actually go eat it in the real world. So, the most perfect pizza I can imagine is a real pizza that I could go get. So if you haven't seen how this applies to God, here's the thing. Imagine that there is a perfect being who created you and everything else, who loves you, who cares about you, who has a plan for you, who's rooting for you, and who's ready to reward you with everything that you could possibly ever want. Okay, now imagine that that's a fictional character from a book that wasn't meant to be taken seriously in the way that Romeo and Juliet weren't real. Okay, now imagine that there's a deity that has those exact same qualities but actually is real and actually did create you and actually literally has a place called heaven where you will be rewarded for these things. Now, which one's better? The fictional God that only exists in your head, or the real God who actually loves you and cares about you? Well, obviously, the real one is better. So, remember the definition. If God is the most perfect thing I can imagine, well, the most perfect thing I can imagine would actually exist, because that's better. Right? A fake God isn't the most perfect thing I can imagine, because the most perfect thing I can imagine actually would be real. So God exists by definition. Now, this is a very clever and interesting rational argument, and in symbolic logic, it's actually really interesting. It leads to a proof where you assume God doesn't exist and you get a contradiction. It's very interesting. But here's the thing. Perfection is not a quality existence is not a quality of perfection. So, like, if I'm listing all the characteristics that make something perfect, whether or not that thing is real or imaginary is not a list of perfect qualities. It's the status of whether the thing is real or not. So if I'm describing my perfect life mate, I'm not going to put, like, actually exist in reality on my list, right? I'll have other qualities like intelligence and humor and whatever else is important to me. And then whether or not that person actually exists is a separate matter from whether or not they have good qualities. Existing is not a good quality that makes somebody or something more perfect. It's just the truth of the matter about whether or not that thing is real. So God isn't more perfect if God is real, because perfection doesn't include existence. It includes the qualities, and then whether that thing exists or not is a separate truth value. So ultimately, Descartes' not going to be totally successful. If he was, you wouldn't have people that rejected the existence of this God. But very clever nonetheless. I apologize, it's gotten very dark, and I don't have a light switch close by. It's getting sort of dark and eerie here. So, and much longer again than I anticipated. But thanks for sticking in there. I hope you found this interesting.